Hello and welcome to the very first mini lecture for economics. Now, it's a mini lecture because it's only going to cover a few main points or more complex points from the chapter. This is not going to be comprehensive. You'll still need to fill out your chapter study guide each week. Now, the first two chapters of your book are fairly intuitive and simple vocabulary, but they can have some confusing terms, especially if you've never seen some of these terms before. Today's lecture is going to focus on chapter 1 and specifically economic systems that exist in the world. So there are three main types of economic systems that exist. Number 1 is a traditional economy. Number 2 is a command economy or centrally planned economy. Your book uses command mostly, but those are interchangeable. And lastly, a market system. So a market economy system. So let's start off with what is a traditional economic system? Well, a traditional economic system is what has existed throughout most of time, essentially, where you have a household that produces whatever they consume. And when I say consume, I don't just mean buy, or I shouldn't say buy. I don't mean just eat. I mean purchase, buy, consume, etc. Everything that you consume, you purchase, you buy. That is what I mean by consumption. You're not going to go out and buy extra stuff if you have a traditional economy. More than likely, you're going to be a farmer or a rancher or something like that. And whatever you produce, you eat. And in that instance, there's no incentive to have more education. There's no incentive to have a whole lot of healthcare, etc. Your children, you're only going to raise them to a certain age before they become labor themselves and help you produce more. Essentially, if you are married and you have a husband and a wife, then in that instance, you're going to have one producing and one raising children. And for lack of a better way to put it, essentially, in that instance, the female would become a baby maker, and that would be their purpose. Now, I by no means think this is a good idea. Not at all. Not at all. I am glad for economic growth and productivity that brings us a lot of things. For instance, the ability to record this video. That would not exist in a traditional economy because you only produce what you consume. So if you have this romantic view of what life would be like in a little house on the prairie or in settling times, when you would come out and homestead, you should probably forget that, because that's not how life was. You more than likely would have some of your siblings die of really bad diseases. You yourself wouldn't live to a certain age, etc. Now, there are some types of traditional economies that still exist today, but for the most part, it's not a good way to organize a whole economy at all. So the next system is what we call a command economy or centrally planned economy. I'm going to use the word command mostly throughout the semester. So command economy literally means the government or a central agency or something like that decides what gets produced, how much gets produced, and at what price it is produced at. Now, before you start thinking, oh, that's socialism, which you might be a little bit on the right track, and that's got to be a horrible system, please hear me out. We actually have command economies in the United States, and I'm thankful for certain types of command economies that we have in the United States. So a command economy is essentially whenever the government produces a good or service and at a certain price. Now, for example, our police in the United States typically are command economies, right? The government produces the police force. And here in the city of Lubbock, we have a police force, and any police officer that's part of the city of Lubbock is paid for by taxpayers of the city of Lubbock. And we decide how much their pay is, and we decide how many police we need, etc. You probably didn't think I was going there with command economy, especially if you're really into the socialism versus communism, capitalism, etc. Now, that doesn't mean that government always does what's right. You can look at education. We do need the government involved in education, though, 100%. Now, hear me out on that one, too. If the government didn't produce education, especially elementary and high school education, then literally we would be paying only for private schools, which would mean that my children, who are 8 years old and 5 years old, kindergartner and a second grader starting school, they would either have to go to a private school, which my wife and I would pay for, or they would have to figure out a way to pay for it themselves. And as much as I love my two boys, they really don't have any marketable skills. And I don't think they would be able to pay for school by themselves. So it's a good thing that we actually produce education and we try to train children so that they are better members of society, can go get jobs, be functioning part of our overall economic system in a good way and maximize their own happiness, right? So there are command economies that exist in the United States. We can go way overboard and say something like healthcare or something to that nature where the government 100% produces it. But what I want you to see is just because it's a command economy doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. The degree at which we want the government to be involved with command economies tells us a lot. Now, I typically come under the view that the government shouldn't be involved unless there's something called a market failure. Now, a market failure is when the market doesn't produce the best result. So going back to the example of the police officer, that would be a market failure. The reason why is that if I were to pay a company to be my protection for policing, that'd be very expensive and it would create this wrong incentive on both ends. Our incentives would not line up correctly. For example, if I were getting robbed or something like that, and I needed a police officer to help me, and they came over and said, you know what, if you pay me $100, I'll help you. That's not the system we want. We want police officers not to worry about pay and just protect us, right? Same thing goes with our military. But you didn't know or think that they are actually a command economy, what some people would call socialism, because the government produces our military, right? We would not want a system in which the military could just decide to turn on us at any point in time because we were paying a business instead of an actual government agency to produce our military. Now, we can all talk about whether we do it correctly or to what extent we need to be involved, especially when it comes to things like education. I personally don't know if the government does a great job with education, but I do think that they need to produce education, especially for younger kids. All right, so back onto market economies. So market economies exist when there's not a market failure. And that's typically the best way to organize economy. Think capitalism. I won't use that word so much, capitalism and socialism, because we really don't use them in economics because things are kind of mixed. You'll see that in a second. But markets are by far the best way to produce. You have buyers and sellers, and we'll talk about equilibriums and supply and demand curves later on. But at this point, all you need to know is that a market economy, you have a buyer and a seller, and if someone wants to produce something and there's the demand for it and someone's willing to pay for it, you're going to produce what you need. For example, even though I don't really know why Kim Kardashian gets paid as much as she does, there's enough people that watch her that they're willing to pay and watch her, or willing to at least watch for the advertisements, which pay her to produce videos, etc., and endorse products. That's in a market economy. That's not a failure. That exists, right? There's no reason for the government to intervene and say that shouldn't exist. If I want to watch Texas Tech football or the Denver Broncos, I pay that. If I want to record an economics video and you are willing to pay to learn economics from me, that is a market system. That's a good system. Regardless of whether I am willing personally to pay for it or not, if there's enough consumers that are willing to pay for it, it'll exist. And we've seen that over the last year and a half, that when the market exists in a good way, we can have new pharmaceutical inventions, we can have new healthcare advances, we can really grow as an economy. Businesses can figure out how to produce and have curbside service when they never did before. That is a market working like it should. All right, last thing. Most markets are mixed. And in the United States, we have what's called a quasi-market. What that means is that we have a mixture of both market economy and command economy. Remember, I said the government produces education, military, police, even firefighters on our local level. Well, that means that it's not 100% market. It's not 100% market, which wouldn't be a good thing either, right? We've covered that already. There's market failures. So we have a mixture, but we lean toward the market system, which is a good system in my view, which means that because we lean toward a market economy, then the government is not going to produce extra and be involved extra beyond what is necessary. Now, we can all argue whether they are over-involved or not with regulations, etc. But we have a quasi-market. Now, if you lean more toward the command side, you'd be called a quasi-command economy. Now, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I know this was a short video. Hopefully, it helped you understand the different economic systems. I'm going to record these in the future as well for more complex concepts, including formulas, etc. And we'll see how it goes. Welcome to Economics.